And this file captures all of the key parameters that we want to use to actually run PackStack. So for example, here's our SSH key that we generated so that we can actually talk to all of our core machines. Default password, by default the system will actually generate, and actually has gone through and generated random passwords for most things. And that's fine. We don't actually have to set one, set this one as a default because all the other services have something. I'm actually going to go and change some of the passwords just to make them more human manageable, specifically access into the administrative user passwords. The rest of the passwords are things like the Nova service or the Neutron service or some of these other services interacting with Keystone. Those can all be programmatic because they're going to live in config files, and so we're not going to touch those. As we go through this file, I'm going to basically go through the entire file because there are parameters just about through the entire thing that have to be touched. Many of them are going to stay the same. So for example, I'm not going to define a default. Actually, I could define a default just to have one here. We'll say one cloud. Really simplistic. MariaDB, yes, we need a database, and we're going to install it on the same node locally. I would like Glance. I would like Cinder. Actually, in this case, I'm not going to install Cinder. And the reason for that is that my Cinder environment is only going to be used for the actual OpenStack systems that I deploy on top of this system, not for the core. Everything I'm going to do is going to use ephemeral, so I don't actually need the Cinder service in this case. So in this case, I'll turn it off. That also means that it's not going to be looking for an LVM volume or some other Cinder capability. As you'll see, there will be configurations for that, so we'll bypass that one. I do absolutely need Nova. I would like Neutron because I'm going to use the Linux bridge capability that Neutron's going to drive. I would like Horizon. It's always nice to have a user interface. I do not need Swift. So again, one of the defaults that normally would be deployed, and deployed in a demonstrative fashion, so it will actually create little loopback disks so that there is a local little tiny Swift installation available. We're going to bypass that. Ceilometer, I would like Ceilometer just because I'd actually like to do some monitoring. By default, the system does not deploy heat. I am actually going to deploy heat because at some point I'm going to actually use heat to actually run the deployments of my overstack systems. By default today, I'm going to not do that. I'm not going to install Sahara, which is the analytics as a service, or Trove capabilities. I'm also not going to install the Ironic service. Last time I tried Ironic with PackStack with the Juno 1 build, I believe, did not work, so I'm going to avoid that anyway. Ironic would actually be kind of useful for this environment because I could then use this all-in-one node to deploy more OpenStack systems or more systems into the OpenStack environment, but we're not going to do that in this particular case either. Clients, these would be all the OpenStack clients like the Nova command line client or Neutron command line client. We certainly would like those. Configure NTP. Yes, I would like NTP so that my systems are in sync. Turns out that my default router is an NTP server, so we'll use that. Very good. Configure Nagios. Yes, I'm going to actually have a little tiny Nagios service. It's really not much. It just looks to make sure that basically the operating systems are up and some of the core services are up. But basic Nagios is fine, and it's good to have it there. Exclude servers. Here you could actually say, hey, I've already run PackStack before, and I don't want you to touch my compute nodes that are running. I want you to do new ones. So you could actually define that there. We have nothing to exclude at the moment. Debug mode. This is useful if you want lots of output from your service. So if you're doing this for learning experience or doing this to actually do some testing of the service, you might want to turn that on. We're going to leave that off. IP addresses. Well, we're only going to deploy one controller, so that's fine. We're going to deploy 2 compute hosts, though. So I'm actually going to have it add onto this one, 10.164.12, which is our CentOS 2 host. So now it'll actually configure both of these machines as it goes through. Network host, the controller is going to be our network host as well, so we're just going to leave that as it stands. We're not going to use VMware backend, but this system will actually configure it appropriately. We're not going to define any other unsupported parameters, and so we're going to skip all the vCenter stuff, not needed. We're not going to, again, we're not going to muck around with Cinder at the moment or Sahara. We could subscribe to Apple. I'm not going to actually touch that. I haven't needed that in the past. And again, if you have Red Hat or Red Hat services and you can use the same RDO with actual Red Hat or RHEL based systems, you can actually configure your Red Hat information. We're not going to, we don't need that. We're not using Satellite, which is another Red Hat service, so we can bypass all of those. AMQP, here we're going to use Rabbit. Don't have to change anything, it's going to use the default host for Rabbit. We're not going to turn on SSL. Again, this is just for a lab environment, not for a public environment, so we're not going to have to deal with that. But the system is configured so that you could turn it on and generate keys for SSL-based service. Database configuration. So here you can start to see where the database, the default passwords are already starting to be set. So here's a random password for the actual database root user. And actually, given that sometimes you actually do want to get into this, and again, this is a lab environment and not something that you would normally otherwise configure, I'm going to make both this and the, oops, PW, take out too much, right? So this is just setting the root user's password to OneCloud, something that I can remember. The actual services databases, I'm going to leave them as their random IDs. I could actually pull this out of a data file if I actually need to get access to them. The admin token, this is a one-time token that gets used as a way to initially configure Keystone. Long random string, that's fine. Admin user password, again, I'm never going to be these users, and this information ends up in a config file anyway, and so that's fine. And again, off we go. Configuring these backend services. If you used LDAP or configured any others, there's additional configuration here. In this case, notice the identity backend is SQL, so it's actually just going to use the database to actually store configuration information. But you could actually configure LDAP if you had an LDAP environment to actually tie into. You can see there's a lot there. Glance, so we're going to configure Glance. We're going to use the file backend, which means that Glance is just going to store data on the local disk instead of something like a Swift backend or alternate backend to Glance. Cinder, again, even though we're not configuring it, it does actually store or create the data sets for it. And this is where you would define things like whether or not you want the system to actually create some volumes for you. Using the LVM backend, just be aware that it's going to expect to see something like a Cinder-volumes LVM volume group to actually create Cinder volumes into. But it does support more than just that. So the general functionality here is actually pretty complete. You could set up NetApp and a bunch of other things for Cinder. We'll just keep going. So now we're in the Nova section. Again, database access. These are some areas that you might be interested in changing. Allocation, what oversubscription number of CPUs to virtual CPUs are you going to allow? In this case, it's saying 16:1. That's fine. We'll actually probably never get to that. Memory oversubscription, same thing. How much do you want to set? You probably don't want to set it to a whole lot. 1.5 seems to be a pretty reasonable number. To give you a little bit more flexibility in your environment. Most of the rest of this you don't have to change. We're not actually going to set up Nova Network. So this would be if you're setting up Nova Network services, and it's actually odd that it's Compute Private Interface because it's really Nova Network Private Interface. But in this case, we're not going to adjust any of these. We're going to actually use Neutron for our networking service. All right, now we're getting into the Neutron section. So if we set up Neutron for an L3 service capability, it's going to expect to create a BR-EX bridge. We're actually not going to do that. Our environment is not going to use routing in this underlay network. We're going to use the Linux bridge components anyway and not Open Virtual Switch, which would be the more common use case in this particular walkthrough. ML2 type drivers, this is an important configuration to set. Actually, as is load balancing. If you want to actually do load balancing, you would set that here. If you wanted to have firewall services enabled, that would also assume the L3 routing services mapped in. You would enable that here. And then for ML2 type drivers, instead of VXLAN, I'm actually going to use VLAN. And tenant network types, we're going to actually say VLAN and flat.